She was 31 years old, a widow 6 months deep, and on the morning the will was read her in-laws did not even pretend to grieve. They laughed, because the only thing left to her was a leaning pine-board cottage on the north quarter of Cedar Hollow, a place the assessor had valued, on paper, at $3. That was her inheritance. $3 worth of rotten pine sap, signed over with the sneer and the stamped envelope of a lawyer who smiled when he slid the pen, because Ezekiel Calloway and his wife Cordelia could not abide the daughter-in-law their son had chosen standing in the same room as the family silver. The banker Emberson Voss had already paid them a tidy sum for the land around it, but the cottage itself, set crooked on its little rise, was not worth hauling off. So she took it. She took the $3 and the keys, and she walked 4 miles in the dust with a leather bag in one hand and the sum total of her life in the other. She did not know, then, that inside those crooked walls was hidden a royal inheritance, sealed, silent, waiting, that would restore what she had lost and return a debt the entire valley thought forgotten. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Wren Calloway. That if you're watching tonight from a place that feels forgotten or set aside, tell us where you are in the comments. We read everyone. Wren Whitfield had been raised in a small clapboard house 12 miles north of Cedar Hollow, the second daughter of a Welsh-born schoolmaster named Ever Whitfield and his wife Ada, who kept bees and read aloud to her daughters by lamplight every evening. Her father had crossed the Atlantic in 1852 with a trunk of books and a conviction that the new country, for all its noise and iron, still needed people who could write a clean sentence and treat a neighbor fairly. He taught in 3 mining camps before the family settled, and from him Wren learned the 2 things that would one day matter most. How to read a man's handwriting the way a woodsman reads tracks, and how to keep a ledger without losing a single mark that mattered. Her mother, Ada, educated at a young ladies' academy in Cardiff before she eloped with the schoolmaster, taught Wren a quieter virtue she called the care of small things. When a button fell off a coat, you sewed it on before sundown. When a letter arrived, you read it twice. When a friend was grieving, you brought bread and did not stay long. These were small disciplines, Ada used to say, but small disciplines had held up empires. Wren grew tall and quiet, with brown hands from the apiary and quick eyes that noticed what other people overlooked, the wrong number in a freight bill, the loose nail on a stable door. She could read a room the way her father read a page, and she had a memory for names that put her elders to shame. At 16 she was working as a clerk in a dry goods store in Butte, and at 19 she had refused 2 offers of marriage because the men, however kind, did not ask about the books in her shop. In the spring of 1882 a young surveyor named Tobias Calloway walked into the store to buy a length of indigo ribbon for his sister, and he stayed an hour and 40 minutes talking to Wren about Welsh poetry and the proper way to read a contour map. He proposed on the tailgate of a freight wagon in October, and they were married by her father in the small chapel behind the schoolhouse on a cold afternoon when the cottonwoods had gone entirely gold. They moved to Cedar Hollow in early winter of 1883 and bought a 2-room house on Locust Street with what Tobias had earned from his survey work. Tobias was gentle and meticulous. He measured things twice and listened to his wife at the kitchen table the way most men of that territory listened only to sermons and whiskey. Within a year Wren was pregnant, and within 2 years she had buried the infant, a son, born too early, who had lived only long enough to grip her finger once. Tobias held her through the long nights after, and in the spring of 1886 they began to hope again. The valley was beginning to boom, the Montana Central was hiring Tobias to survey a new spur line to the west, and the work paid well enough that Wren, at 29, allowed herself to imagine a future larger than what she had known as a girl. This is the woman we want you to see. Hard-working, observant, patient, and quietly schooled in the discipline of small things. A woman whose father had taught her to read a man's hand and whose mother had taught her to honor the overlooked. We will need every one of those things before this story is done. 1886. Tobias had gone up onto the north rim to take final measurements for a trestle crossing, and rotten timber on the catwalk gave way beneath him. He fell 48 feet into the cut below and was dead before his partner could reach him. When they carried him down into Cedar Hollow wrapped in a wagon sheet, Wren was in the kitchen scalding milk for a pudding, and she knew what had happened from the way the men stood at the gate and would not come up the path. She stood very still with the wooden spoon in her hand, and then she went to the door and made them bring him in. From that morning on she did not weep in front of another human being for 9 straight months. The Calloways arrived in force within the hour. Ezekiel, Tobias's father, was a broad raw-boned man who had made his money in the early copper strikes and saw the rest of the world, including his own children, as instruments of his appetite. Cordelia, his wife, was a thin sharp-faced woman who had never forgiven Tobias for marrying a clerk's daughter. And Darrow, Tobias's younger brother, who had been a sour bystander at the wedding and a sourer one ever since. They did not comfort Wren. They did not bring her bread. They did not sit with her in the kitchen that first night, or the second, or any night after. What they did was send a lawyer. The lawyer was Mr. Penniman, and he came 4 days after the funeral with a polished document and a small, patient smile. The Calloways, he explained, had been advancing Tobias his salary for the past year, and so the family held claim to most of what Tobias owned, the house, the tools, the horse, the surveying instruments, and the small savings in the Cedar Hollow bank. The document, near as Penniman could make plain, left Wren the contents of one trunk, her clothes, and such portion of the estate as the family in charity might assign. That assignment, Penniman told her, would be made known at the reading on the following Thursday. The reading took place in the front parlor of the Calloway house, with Cordelia stirring sugar into her tea and Ezekiel looking out the window at the rain. Darrow sat on the settee with his hat on. When Penniman finished, Wren's portion was her late husband's coat, a wedding quilt her mother had made, $2 in coin, and, by special provision of Ezekiel Calloway, the cottage on the North Quarter Road valued at $3 for the purposes of inheritance. That was the joke. They had marked the property down to a sum so small it insulted the very word. They had laughed when Penniman read it. Darrow had laughed. Even Cordelia had, lifting one corner of her mouth above the rim of her teacup. "You may take the cottage on Monday," Penniman said, sliding the pen across the table, "or sign it over to the family for $1. The choice is yours, Mrs. Calloway." Wren took the pen in both hands. She did not sign. She took the cottage. She took the coat and the quilt and the $2 and the small leather bag she had brought to the reading, and she walked out into the rain, down the road toward a leaning pine-board cottage that smelled of mice and old chinking. She had not yet learned what was inside the walls she had just inherited, and she was already thinking about how to repair the roof. The cottage sat on a quarter-acre of dry scrub at the bend of an old wagon trail, set about 100 yards back from the road under an enormous pine whose roots had begun to lift the front step. It was, on the day she arrived, everything the Calloways had meant it to be, a small, cold, foolish thing. 2 rooms and a lean-to kitchen, a stone chimney that smoked in any wind, a door whose hinges had been mostly replaced by rope, and a roof that leaked in 3 places into tin pails she had to borrow from a neighbor. The assessor had valued it at $3 and the Calloways had signed it over at $3, and on that morning Wren did not think that value was unfair. She thought it was the truest mirror of what the world had decided she was worth. We should tell you something she did not know. 15 years earlier, in the long grim winter of 1872, a man had arrived in Cedar Hollow who gave his name as Alexander Sable. He was a tall, stooped, foreign-looking gentleman past 60, with a scholar's stoop to his shoulders and a long gray beard he kept tied with a black silk ribbon. He wore clothes of good cut but shabby wear, a velvet waistcoat rubbed thin at the elbows, a bowler hat whose band was cracked in 2. He bought this same leaning cottage, in cash, and lived in it the rest of his days. He did not keep a horse or a wife. He did not entertain. He wrote. That was all the valley knew of him. He wrote in the front room by a lamp every night, and once a week walked into town for flour and a single newspaper, and twice a week walked out to the North Ridge and back, alone. The children of Cedar Hollow grew up thinking Mr. Sable was a wizard. The men thought he was Mad de Mar. Sable died in February of 1879, in his sleep, in the cottage, and the county buried him at the small cemetery north of town. There being no relatives or heirs, the cottage reverted to the original homestead claimant's surviving family, and so, through a long chain of tax sales and quiet transfers, it had ended up in the Calloway name. By the time it passed, in 1886, to the widow Wren, the place had been empty 7 years and the mice had it. But Mr. Sable, before he died, did one last thing that no one in Cedar Hollow knew about. He walked to the back wall of the second room, the one whose chimney always smoked, and he pried 3 short planks from the inside sheathing, just above the baseboard, behind a spot where the chinking had crumbled away. He set into the cavity a leather case, the size of a family Bible, wrapped twice in oilcloth, and sealed it there with 12 hand-forged nails driven one-handed in the dark. Then he replaced the planks, tied them with twine, and rechinked the seam with a mortar of pine pitch and limestone dust, in exactly the same dry shade as the wall around it. Mr. Sable understood small disciplines. He had been raised to them. Wren discovered him by accident, in her 3rd week, when she was pulling apart the south wall to rechink what had gone soft. A length of pine came away in her hand, behind it she saw a darker patch of wood, mismatched at the grain, and, on closer look, the faint ridge of nail holes that had been hammered in and then disguised with paste. She went to get her father's old hand axe, and in the soft light of late afternoon she knelt and worked the 3 hidden planks free with the patience of a woman who had been taught to care for small things. Behind the planks, in the cavity, she found the oilcloth. Behind the oilcloth, the leather case. Inside the case, a packet of yellowed papers, tied twice in red wax thread, and beneath the papers a small velvet pouch that gave a faint, dry rattle when she lifted it. She untied the thread. She unrolled the first page. The handwriting was in 2 languages, Polish on the left side of every sheet, and English on the right, in a careful pen she recognized as the pen of a man who had once been a scholar. At the top of the first page was a single line, in English. To whoever finds this, and can read it, the inheritance of Count Alexander Zaleski Korecki, by the grace of the late King Stanislaus, of the House of Korecki, returns at last to its own. She sat with the case on the floor, in the dust, in the long slant of afternoon light, and she read. What Wren read filled the better part of the next 2 afternoons, because Alexander Zaleski Korecki had been a man who did not believe in saying a thing once if it required saying it 3 times. He had been a count of an old Polish house whose properties, in the partitions following the failed November uprising of 1830, had been seized by the Russian crown. The Korecki holdings, lands in Volhynia, a string of estates along the But River, a famous library, a working silver mine in the Carpathians, had gone into imperial hands in a single signing. His elder brother had been exiled to Siberia. His sister had married a French diplomat and gone to Lyon. Alexander himself, then in his early 20s, had been smuggled out by a network of family priests and landed in 1833 on the dock at Boston, with 7 silver coins sewn into his waistband and a Polish prayer book in his coat. He had worked as a tutor in Philadelphia, as a clerk in a Cleveland ironworks, as a translator for a steamship line in New York, and finally, in 1862, as a correspondent for a Stanislaus Emigre Society out of Chicago, which, after the silence of 1863, had begun the long quiet work of recovering what their scattered families had lost. That it was the work of that society, around 1868, that had assembled the dossier Wren now held. There were certified church records from 3 parishes, sworn translations into English, a notarized family genealogy tracing the Korecki line back to 1483, a hand-drawn coat of arms in 3 tinctures, and, at the bottom of the leather case, rolled tight, the original royal patent of confirmation, in Latin and Polish, bearing the wax seal of King Stanislaus II and countersigned by the Crown Chancellery of Poland-Lithuania. This was the certified proof that Alexander Zaleski Korecki, by the law of the Partition Kingdom and by the Unilateral Restoration Act of the Polish Senate in exile in 1869, was the sole surviving rightful heir of the Korecki holdings, to be claimed, in his absence or in the absence of his heirs, by any Christian soul of Polish blood who could prove themselves a lineal descendant of the house. There were arguably none. There were also, folded behind the patent, 3 pages of penciled annotations in Alexander's own hand, and a small piece of news that raised Wren's hands off the paper. In 1881, Alexander had written, a niece of his elder brother's wife had emigrated from Lyon to the United States with her 3 children, the eldest a girl of 14, and had settled. He had tracked her through Montreal, through the Great Northern Railroad, and on a freight stage up into the territory, somewhere in the valley north of where he then lived. He had not had the courage to introduce himself before he died. He had, instead, written her name in pencil. He had written her street. He had written, "If she is who I think she is, then this house and what is in it is hers by blood and by law, and I have only been its keeper." Wren set the paper down. She lifted the velvet pouch and untied it. Inside, in a folded handkerchief of silk so old it had gone the color of weak tea, were 48 gold sovereigns, each bearing the effigy of Tsar Nicholas I, odd currency for a Polish count to keep, but a clear and clever provenance for an exile to carry. Beside the sovereigns lay a small coral-handled penknife, a man's seal ring of plain gold bearing the Korecki crest, a length of fine red ribbon his mother had tied into his hair on the day he left, and a pair of cuff buttons cut from a single moonstone. And then there was the last item, the one Wren did not at first understand. It was a single sheet of heavy parchment in Spanish, headed Real Cedula, dated Madrid, 1795, bearing the royal seal of His Catholic Majesty Charles IV. It was a land grant, a real, royal, Spanish colonial land grant, conveying to one Don Mateo Zaleski, of the royal household of His Most Catholic Majesty, the mineral and pastoral rights over a tract described as El Valle del Cedro, the Valley of the Cedar. It had never been registered in any American land office. It had been carried from Madrid to Krakow, from Krakow to Vilnius, from Vilnius to Boston, and finally to Cedar Hollow, where, in a cottage at the bend of an old wagon trail, an old man had wrapped it twice in oilcloth and sealed it inside a wall. The tract it described, long, carefully surveyed, bearing the names of rivers and ridges that Wren had known since childhood, was the entirety of what Cedar Hollow's mining families had built their claims upon. The embattled Mr. Voss, who had paid the Calloways to remove the inconvenience of their daughter-in-law, was sitting, in the iron of his privity, on land that did not, by the laws of 2 crowns and an exile's patient scholarship, belong to him at all. Wren sat down on the iron cot. She looked at the papers in her lap. She looked at the gold sovereigns in the velvet pouch. She looked, for a long time, out the door of the cottage, at the pine tree, at the dip of the valley under the late afternoon, at the smoke rising from the chimneys of the town whose foundations were quietly, lawfully, hers. She thought about $3 cottages, and laughed, and put her face in her hands, and wept. Over the next several weeks she worked quietly. She stitched the leather case back into its cavity, sealed it again with her own nails, and rebuilt the wall in front of it so the seam was invisible even to her. She took the sovereigns and the ring and the penknife and the ribbon and the moonstone cuff buttons and the photographs out of the case and put them, wrapped in a clean flour sack, into a small strongbox she had bought with $2.40 of her inheritance. Then, on a cold morning in early November, she walked to the bank, where the cashier accepted the sovereigns at face value and counted out, in greenbacks, $497.50. She opened a savings account in her own name. She did not tell a soul. She had work to do, and that work was not yet to claim. She had read, in the dossier, the line Alexander had underlined twice in red. It said, "Do not seek redress in haste, seek first the heir whose blood is your proof. If the heir is found and willing, let the law speak. If the heir is dead, let the documents rest until they are needed." There was a name penciled in the margin of that page, Mrs. Anneliese Vrebeckbos, of Cedar Hollow, the wife of the town's wagon repair man, and the grandmother, by her elder daughter, of a girl called Opal who had stood, in 1881, 14 years old, on the platform at the station outside town. Wren had seen that girl once. She had seen her in the milliner's window that September, looking at a hat she could not afford, and Wren had, without thinking, gone in and bought it for her. She had not known why she had done it. Now she knew. The conflict arrived in December, when Emerson Voss, banker, mining baron, and the man who had quietly bought from the Calloways the pleasant fiction of Wren's exclusion, made his move. He filed a foreclosure against the cottage on the ground that a back tax of $1.12, overdue from the previous tenant, was now her responsibility. The summons came by a boy on a pony, and the date of the hearing was set for the 3rd Friday of the month. Wren read the summons, folded it, and tucked it into her pocket. She went to see Jonas Mead, the old carpenter and friend of her late husband, and asked him, in a voice as steady as her father's at the breakfast table, to draw her a map of the North Quarter, the South Quarter, and the disputed creek bottom, every claim, every patent, every transfer, every surveyor's mark. Jonas did not ask why. He brought the map on a Wednesday, in a roll of brown paper, and laid it on Wren's kitchen table, and they spent 2 evenings reading it. On the morning of the hearing, Wren walked into the Cedar Hollow courthouse, where Emerson Voss was waiting with his lawyer and a small smirk. With her she carried the brown paper map from Jonas, a sworn affidavit she had paid a justice of the peace in Helena to certify, and a single sheet of foolscap on which she had hand-copied, in her own clear hand, the first paragraph of the Real Cedula of 1795, with a notarized translation into English, and the name of the grantee, Don Matteo Zaleski. She did not yet produce the original. She did not yet produce the sovereigns, the seal, the genealogical proof. She sat down before the magistrate, in the patient tone of a woman who had been taught to care for small things, the simple proposition that the entire north quarter of the valley was not the property the Cedar Hollow Bank had been selling for 15 years, and that the foreclosure she was being asked to honor was a foreclosure on a portion of a tract whose true title had been quietly and lawfully registered, by the grace of 2 crowns, somewhere it had never been looked for. The magistrate, a tired man named Yarrow, who did not like Voss and liked Wren less, listened. He looked at the affidavit. He looked at the certified translation. He set the hearing for continuation in 90 days and ordered, in the meantime, that no foreclosure proceedings be brought against the Calloway cottage or its quarter-acre. Emerson Voss stood up from the table. He was, for the first time in 23 years of banking in Cedar Hollow, not smiling. What followed was the long, careful labor of a woman with a square of foolscap, a savings account, and a small black book of names. Wren did not seek the spotlight. She sought, as Alexander had told her in his final line of advice, the heir whose blood was her proof. She walked to the milliner's on Locust Street on a Saturday in early January and asked, as casually as she could, after the girl who had once stood looking at a hat. The milliner smiled and sent a boy up the lane with a note. On Monday afternoon, Opal Vrabeck came down to the cottage alone, wearing the very hat Wren had bought her 2 autumns before. Wren sat with her at the kitchen table and told her, slowly, with the long flowing patience of a teacher, the story of a Polish count who had died behind a hidden wall, and the documents that proved, by blood and by law, where she and her family had come from. Opal wept. So did her grandmother, Annalise, when Wren walked her through the same account, 2 days later, with the genealogical proof laid open on the table. Annalise had been born in Lyon, her mother had been the niece of the elder Zaleski brother. The line ran straight back, unbroken, through the marriage register of a small Catholic parish outside Krakow, and through the ship passenger lists of 1881, to the doorsill of Alexander's cottage in the year of his death. She touched the seal ring with one finger and held it up to the light. The Korecki crest, in fine engraving, lay sharp against the gold. Annalise set the ring down. She did not take it. She said, in a quiet voice, "We had imagined we were alone in the world." At Annalise's request, Wren wrote the letter that opened the 2nd chapter. It was addressed, in her own hand, to the imperial and royal trustees of the Polish Senate in exile, in care of the Stanislaus Society in Chicago, and it enclosed, in a packet sealed with the coral-handled penknife, the genealogical proof, the certified translation of the Real Cedula, a sworn affidavit of the discovery, and a letter requesting formal recognition of the Korecki heirs as the rightful inheritors of the dispossessed Volhynian estates and, in the matter of the American tract, an immediate survey and royal reconveyance of the Valley of the Cedar, on terms consistent with the laws of 2 crowns. The reply arrived in March, by registered post, on heavy paper bearing the faded seal of the Stanislaus Society. The trustees recognized Annalise Vrabeck Voss, her daughter, and her granddaughter as lineal and lawful heirs of the House of Korecki. They authorized, in the name of the partitioned kingdom and in the name of 2 restorations they had spent their lifetimes drafting, the reconveyance of the Valley of the Cedar, to be held, in perpetual trust, by the heirs in equal partnership with the sitting settlers, in a quiet charter whose first clause bound the trustees to administer the land for the benefit of those already living upon it. The title to the valley itself was to be retained by the heirs, the use of it, in parcels and in perpetuity, was to be returned, at no cost, to the families whose cabins and claims already stood upon it. Emberson Voss's 15 years of paper claims were declared, in the third clause, void from the origin. In the public square, on a windy Saturday in May, the charter was read aloud by the clerk of the court, and 314 settlers of the Valley of the Cedar signed it, in their own hands, on a long oak table that Wren and Jonas Mead had carried down from the workshop. Ezekiel Calloway, informed that the family's long resentment had finally outlived its welcome in the valley, left for Butte. Darrow Calloway, 3 weeks later, left for Helena. Cordelia stayed in the Calloway house a few more months, and then the house went up for sale, and a young couple from Kansas bought it with a loan from the Cedar Hollow Bank, that very bank, now under new management, that held, in a quiet safe in the back, a single sheet of foolscap on which was the certified statement that it had, in fact, no claim on the land it had been selling that in the autumn of 1887. On a windy evening under the great pine at the bend of the wagon trail, Wren Calloway came to the cottage for the last time as its keeper. Annalise was with her, and Opal, and Jonas, and the Czech carpenter who had rebuilt the wall, and the small boy Annalise had brought from Lyon, who had grown up under the wrong name and had only just learned his true one. They unsealed the cavity behind the wall and took out, together, what was left. The case was empty now of its sovereigns, of its seal, of its deed, and the oilcloth was folded with the patience of a woman who had been taught to care for small things. Annalise set a single candle before the cavity and lifted, in the candlelight, a small photograph of Alexander, taken in Boston in 1833, a young man in a black coat carrying a single valise. She set it on the windowsill. She did not take the photograph with her. She said, in the same quiet voice she had used on the day the ring had been on the table, he was its keeper. So were we, and so it came round. The woman who had walked 4 miles in the dust with a leather bag and the sum total of her life in it, who had been given a leaning pine-board cottage for $3, with whom her in-laws had laughed and the banker had not bothered to pretend, had quietly, without anger and without triumph, returned to the valley what had been taken from it. She had not done it for herself. She had done it because her father, the Welsh schoolmaster, had taught her to read a man's hand, and because her mother, Ada, who had kept bees, had taught her that empires were carried by small disciplines, and because the man she had loved had been the kind of man who listened to his wife at the kitchen table, and because Alexander Zaleski Korecki, in the long winter before he died, had trusted that someone would one day come who could read what he had written, and because that someone had been her. We began this story with a woman who had nothing. We ended with the valley whole. We began it with a $3 cottage and a piece of paper. We ended with a charter and a quiet safe in the back of a bank. We began it with $3. We ended with 153 families restored to a piece of ground they had, all along, only ever been borrowing. The arithmetic of value, we have learned by now, was never the arithmetic the Calloways had set down on paper. It was the arithmetic of patience, and of small disciplines held to in the long dark, and of a single wall, pried open, that had carried its secret for 15 years of mice and chinking smoke, waiting for the right pair of hands to find it. Settle in, we said at the opening, and let us tell you the story of Wren Calloway. We have told it. We have told you of a $3 cottage, and a royal inheritance hidden in its walls, and we have told you, as the Count had asked of whoever could read him, what it was. If you have stayed with us this evening, we are grateful. If this story moved something in you, a memory, an old name, a piece of ground you have not thought of in years, tell us in the comments. We read every one. And if there is a place in your week that feels forgotten, a borrowed tool that has outlived its first owner, a piece of paper that has been waiting in a drawer, we'd ask you, gently, this one question: what is a time you found value in something others had written off? We will sit with your answers for as long as it takes. Until next time, stay close.